Hi everyone, welcome to Lesson 5 of Theme 3 GCSE Geography. So we're going to look at the factors that affect how vulnerable a country, a city or a person is to the impact of a tectonic hazard. So what we mean by a tectonic hazard is anything that's caused by plate tectonics. So volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and tsunamis. And what we mean by vulnerability, we're actually going to look at the true definition, but it's basically what we're talking about today is an earthquake of exactly the same size might hit San Francisco on the west coast of America, and then it might hit Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, an island in the Caribbean. And the impact, the effects of that earthquake would be very different because of various factors. Haiti is very poor, the west coast of America is very rich. So there are factors linked to how developed a country is that might mean that you're hit worse or not as badly. There are other factors relating to people, so whether you're male or female, your gender, whether you're disabled, whether you're young or old. So those are social factors, economic factors linked to development, like I've just said, and then there's environmental factors as well, if you live on a steep slope or you live near a plate margin. So there's lots of things that affect how heavily affected you would be if an earthquake, volcanic eruption or tsunami happened in your area. So what we're going to do today is write down the meaning of some new key terms, such as vulnerability. I'm going to give you a load of factors that affect vulnerability, and we're going to make a massive spider diagram about them, and then we're going to interpret a set of data and explain it using the factors affecting vulnerability that we've just learnt about. So if you pause the video here a moment, go ahead and write down today's title, and we'll get started. Okay, so first up, a couple of definitions. Vulnerability and capacity. How vulnerable you are, this is how able you are to cope with a disaster, or your inability to cope. Basically, how likely you are to die. Okay, so if you live in a very poor area, if you're old, like it or not, if you're a woman, if you're disabled, and in some cases, your location. So do you live directly on a fault line where there's lots of earthquakes? Do you live close to the coastline that is affected by underwater earthquakes that generate tsunamis? Do you live close to a volcano that creates pyroclastic flows? Do you live on marginal land? That means it's on the edges of what is survivable, of what is livable. So it might be a floodplain, it might be a really steep slope that's vulnerable to landslides and things like that. So basically, vulnerability is how likely are you to die, okay? Capacity is your ability to recover. So this is how well can you survive. So when a disaster happens, how quickly do you recover, basically? So do you have access to lots of resources, money and building materials, rescue equipment, healthcare, education and understanding? So if you don't know that ground shaking near the coast is an underwater earthquake and there may be a tsunami coming, you don't know to get out the way. So basic levels of education, if you don't have that, if you can't read tsunami warning signs, if you can't understand tsunami text alerts and earthquake hazard maps, then you're not going to be able to use them to help you survive. And technology and disaster planning and prediction. We're going to come to this a lot more in a later lesson called the 3 Ps, predict, protect and prepare. So predict is using technologies such as seismographs, tilt meters to roughly guess when an earthquake might happen, and therefore more people are likely to survive. Planning, so looking at where the earthquake zones are and then just not building there. Protection methods that stop buildings from falling on people, all these kind of things. So vulnerability, in short, is how likely are you to die. Capacity is how likely are you to survive and recover from a disaster, and how quickly can you do that. So can we pause the video here a moment and write down in your book exactly what I've got written on this slide. Oh, excuse me, I can't stop yawning today. It's the first day back after Christmas and it's killing me. Okay, right. So we are going to look at a load of factors that affect vulnerability. So don't panic just yet. This looks like a lot right now. I'm going to walk you through it before we create it together. So on the end of each of these arrows, I've got a factor that affects vulnerability. Now, in Theme 3, on the exam paper, they love a factors affecting vulnerability question, and it is usually about why countries at different levels of development might be more or less vulnerable to damage and deaths from a tsunami, an earthquake, or a volcanic eruption. So I'm going to walk you around, and then you are going to add writing for these ones, just like I've already done for these ones. Okay? So if we start here in the top left and go round clockwise. If an area is densely populated, that means there's a lot of people crowded into a small area. That means if you need to try and evacuate them quickly, it's not going to happen. There's going to be panic, it's overcrowded, they're not going to get out in time, you're going to get more deaths. It also normally means you've got a lot of buildings more tightly packed together, so if one falls down, it's probably going to take a load of others with it. Levels of development. Do you have money or don't you? Because unfortunately, usually that means that you are less likely to die in the event of a tectonic hazard. So developed countries tend to have predict, protect and prepare methods in place. Like I said, we'll come to those in a later lesson. The buildings tend to be better quality, so they're less likely to fall on people. There's planning permission and planning laws in place, so people haven't built on steep slopes that are going to landslide during an earthquake. They haven't built on the land right next to the sea that's going to get engulfed in a tsunami if an underwater earthquake happens. Rich countries as well, the capacity to recover, you've got warning systems, you've got healthcare, you've got rescue equipment, you've got emergency services, all of those things that poor countries don't have high levels or efficient infrastructure for. So levels of development is a key one that actually has a lot of other things coming off of it that we'll dig into a little bit more later on when we look at the 3 Ps. Geographical location. For example, if you live on an island, this came up in a past paper once. It gave you some resources about why Haiti might be more vulnerable to the impact of a tectonic hazard because it's an island. So if you need to get off the island, you can't do so quickly. You're surrounded by water. When you then need to get aid and help onto the island, if the docks have been destroyed, you can't get the stuff onto the island that you need, and that's going to lead to secondary deaths when people are then dying from infection, lack of shelter, and injuries that can't be treated because you can't get the resources onto the island. Climate as well. If a disaster happens in a tropical area, for example, it's destroyed people's homes, it's broken the sewage pipes, so that's contaminated all the water supply. It's maybe, if it's a tsunami, it's destroyed crops and things as well. All the water supply is now contaminated by salt water if it's a tsunami. There's lots of things that basically mean that sometimes if the climate in the area is hot, dead bodies lying around, sewage seeping everywhere, contamination in the heat is going to mean a lot more deaths. Because people then, as well, in a tectonic disaster, they don't have any shelter anymore. So they're going to get sunstroke, heat stroke is going to kill a lot more people. If it's an especially cold place, we get earthquakes happening a lot in the Himalayas, and your shelter is destroyed in an earthquake, you've got nowhere to shelter from freezing mountainous conditions. So that's going to kill people from what we call exposure as well. You freeze to death, you get hypothermia. So I've done these ones for you, and you'll notice I've done them in 3 different colours. Any factors that are to do with people, money, or the environment, things that aren't up to us, basically. All right? Now, you don't have to use the same colours as me. You can use any 3 colours you like. But what I'd like you to do is, number 1, take a double page in your book and put this bubble in the middle. Number 2, in any 3 colours you like, copy down the ones I've done as an example so far. Number 3, I then want you to, using the same sort of structure that I've done here, have a think about and write about how, if you're old, that might make you more vulnerable. If you live on marginal land, like a steep slope or an unstable slope, marginal means it's on the edge, it's on the margins of what is safe. If you live on a steep slope, why might that make you more vulnerable? If you're disabled or homeless, why might that make you more vulnerable? If you live in an isolated tribe in the middle of nowhere, no education, no communication, why might that make you more vulnerable? If you live in a slum, tightly packed together shacks made of scrap material. If you're a young child or an orphan, oh, I've accidentally clicked that. Or if you're female, why might that make you more vulnerable? You can see I've got a pregnant woman here in the picture. The pictures, you do have them on the handout that goes with this lesson. They're there really just as a visual stimulus to help you write your own explanation of how each of these factors might make somebody more vulnerable, more likely to die in the event of a tectonic hazard. You don't have to use them. Cut and stick them if you wish. Obviously, yours are going to be more spread out than I've got on the PowerPoint here because you're going to be writing things to go with each one like I've done. Okay? So you'll be writing about young children and orphans and then maybe sticking a picture to go with it. You'll be writing about slum dwellers and then sticking a picture to go with it if you wish. So step 1, take a double page, turn sideways, set out your bubble. Step 2, choose 3 colours and copy the ones that I've got down here so far as an idea of how to do it. Step 3, continuing with those 3 colours, cutting and sticking the pictures if you wish, try to have a think and come up with your own explanations as to why these factors would make you more vulnerable, more likely to die in the event of a tectonic disaster. So pause the video here a moment, go ahead and give that a go please. If you're not sure or you're worried you might get something wrong, do it in pencil first and we'll have a little run through together afterwards. Okay, so let's have a little look if we would maybe get a little bit stuck. So women are physically not as strong or fast on the whole, before any of you get upset, okay? On the whole, like it or not, men are stronger and faster than us, particularly if we're pregnant. You're not going to get anywhere in a hurry if you're heavily pregnant, and that's going to mean that you can't evacuate as easily, and therefore you're more likely to die, you're more vulnerable. Young children and orphans. If there's an earthquake going on, and you're a 4-year-old with no parents, you're not going to know what to do or where to go or how to survive it. Hopefully maybe you're surrounded by some other adults that might help you, but especially in LICs where other natural disasters have maybe struck or you don't have parents, young children aren't going to know what to do, and that makes them more vulnerable. Informal housing, slum dwellers, shanty towns, the homes are built out of scrap material and they're not very stable, so they're more likely to be destroyed, and that's going to cause more deaths. Literally, the shacks will fall on people and crush them. Overcrowding adds to panic and difficulty with evacuation. You've got something like 250,000 people in barely a square kilometre or 2. It's so tightly packed in, they're never going to get out in time. And then also their ability to recover after. Trying to rebuild, you've got no money, no materials, no nothing. If you're homeless, some communities may have been made homeless from previous disasters, so it's sort of linked to the slum dweller one, but this could also apply to HICs, people that are homeless living on the streets. You're more vulnerable, you're more likely to die in the event of a tectonic disaster. If you're disabled, obviously lack of mobility makes evacuation difficult. Please be careful with your spider diagram notes here, all right? I want to see appropriate terminology only. This is a serious spider diagram of actual factors that make you more likely to die, so I don't want to see any inappropriate terminology or thinking that any of these things are funny. But a lack of mobility, if you're wheelchair bound, it is going to make it more difficult for you to evacuate. People living on marginal land, that means land that is already dangerous to live on, really. So you might be right at the base of a volcano, you might be on the fault line, or steep slopes that are more at risk from landslides. Mudslides, that's what a lahar is. This is very common in volcanic eruptions because usually when volcanoes are dormant, they've got snow on top, and then when the volcano erupts, the heat melts the snow and ice, and that creates lots of water that mixes with the volcanic ash and soil, and it creates a mud flow that behaves just like water, and it will engulf entire homes and the people within them. And a pyroclastic flow, we talked about these earlier. If you're old, you don't move as fast. It's as simple as that. Or you might be living on your own, and there's nobody there to help you evacuate, you don't have the support network to help you survive. And minority groups in rural areas, so lack of education and understanding, lack of communication means you don't get warnings, you don't understand warning signs, you're more likely to get trapped and perish in the aftermath of a tectonic disaster. So if you haven't got anything along these lines in your spider diagram, add in some detail and we'll move on. Okay, so what's quite common in an exam is they might give you a table of data like this and ask you to interpret it with a few questions underneath. So what we've got here is a number of countries that all have volcanoes in them, and it tells you how many volcanoes each country has. It also tells you within that country how many cities there are with more than 300,000 people in them. So those are quite big cities, that's 1/3 people. It also tells you the gross national income. This is the average earning per person per year. Okay, and it also tells you the number of people surviving on less than $2 a day. All right, so why? So you're going to have to use your explaining words. It's a why question. Why do volcanoes pose a greater threat in Japan than in Iceland? Which 2 countries may have the greatest vulnerability? Which two countries, basically, are likely to have more people die if one of those volcanoes erupted? Justify your choice. So there's no right or wrong answer as such, but you have to explain why you think two countries that you choose are more likely to have lots of deaths than other countries in the list. So I'd like you to pause the video here a moment, copy out and answer those two questions, but you do not need to copy the data table. Okay, so I'm going to give you a couple of examples of answers that you might have given. Now, I'm only going to go through 2 examples for each one. There are more than 2. But to give you an idea, why do volcanoes pose a greater threat in Japan than in Iceland? So if we take a look at the number of volcanoes first off, Japan has got 118 volcanoes, Iceland's only got 35. So Japan has more volcanoes, 118 versus 35, so there is a greater chance of an eruption, okay, because it's a why question. So don't just make a statement, say why it's that the threat is greater in Japan. If you have a look at the number of cities that are densely populated, that have got a lot of people living in them, Japan has got a lot more densely populated cities than Iceland. In fact, the population of the entire island of Iceland is only just over 300,000. It's got a very low population density. So Japan has more cities with high population density, 19 versus 0 in Iceland. So it's difficult to evacuate and more buildings that could collapse and cause deaths, / there'd be more economic damage. The impact of tectonic disasters isn't just about deaths. It's also about the monetary cost to rebuild. And if you're a rich country, you've got more rich stuff that's going to get destroyed. So the cost of repair is going to be higher quite often. Even though technically those buildings often will have technologies in them that limits the amount of damage. Not many of them will collapse because they've got cross-bracing and earthquake-proof technologies in them, which we'll come on to in the 3 Ps lesson. So on the one hand, yes, fewer buildings may fall down, but the damage that is caused will be more costly to repair. You might have picked up on some other things here. Pose a greater threat in Japan than in Iceland. You may have said that Japan has a slightly lower GNI per person than Iceland, and this could mean that people are less able to recover from the disaster, but really it's talking about the threat. So I would have gone for number of volcanoes or the densely populated number of cities. Which two countries may have the greatest vulnerability to volcanic activity? Justify. So I would look at things like countries that are poor. We're talking about the factors that we put in this spider diagram. I'm looking for countries that are poor. I'm looking for countries that are in a vulnerable location, or I'm looking for things like that. Okay. So for example, straight up, I can see that the Democratic Republic of Congo, the DR Congo, they've only got 6 volcanoes, but their gross national income per person is just $380 per year. And you've got 50 million people living there on less than $2 a day. So I would say Democratic Republic of Congo is very vulnerable because the GNI is only this, and there's a high number of people surviving on this, which means it's a justify question. So I'm saying why I think that, which means that people do not have the resources to protect themselves. Now, if we'd done the 3 Ps lesson, you could go into what resources I'm talking about. We're doing the 3 Ps lesson at the end of this topic. And buildings may not be well built, therefore they're more likely to collapse, therefore more deaths. I also spotted that Indonesia could be very vulnerable, another typo, because there are a high number of cities with a population over 300,000. Indonesia's got 28 cities that are densely populated with over 1/3 people living there, which means the cities are very densely populated, therefore it would be difficult to evacuate, and buildings are tightly packed together, so if one collapses, many may collapse and cause more deaths. You might have picked up on other things to do with low income, to do with overpopulation. You may have picked up on the fact that Indonesia has got the highest number of volcanoes, and that means the greatest chance of an eruption and therefore possibly more deaths. Like I said, there might be other things that you picked up on in here aside from the examples that I've given. But that's the kind of thing you'd need to do when you're given data like this, is pick out something that tells you something and say what it tells you from what you pick out, if that makes sense. Okay? So that's the end of lesson 5. Fairly straightforward and didactic today. We'll move on to looking at specific earthquake, volcano and tsunami events next. So we're going to look at the Haiti earthquake, the Boxing Day tsunami, and the Mount Merapi eruption on the islands in Southeast Asia. So, yeah, moving on to actual tectonic disaster case studies next. If you have any questions, drop me an email, gleasona@hubcymru.net. Otherwise, I'll see you soon for lesson 6.